Despite that tearful denial and plea for bail to attend the funeral of her 2-year-old stepdaughter Lily, Renee Marie King has been denied bond.
I just want to be able to see my kids and my husband and be there with them through this hard time. Tomorrow it's my stepdaughter's burial and I don't even get to be there, and I'm accused of doing something that I never would have done.
Despite
She was just 2 years old, full of life, curious, playful, a child whose world should have been safe, simple, and filled with protection. But what happened to Lily Furneaux would reveal a deeper failure, one far more chilling than any single moment of harm. This wasn't just a case of neglect. It was the quiet collapse of a system meant to protect its most vulnerable. From the outside, it looked like a custody arrangement. Nothing unusual, a mother and father sharing time with their daughter after their relationship ended. But behind the paperwork were months of escalating concern. A mother's voice drowned out by legal jargon, a courtroom that treated her warnings like noise, professionals tasked with protecting children, yet unwilling to take action. In the end, the signs were all there. The resistance, the fears, the reports, the photograph. But the safety net never caught Lily, and by the time anyone truly listened, it was too late. In this case, we are not only looking at what happened, we're looking at why it was allowed to happen, why warnings were ignored, why court decisions overruled expert opinions, why a mother's documented fears were dismissed again and again, and how, even after Lily's death, accountability was met with silence. This documentary has been crafted with care, based on public records, trial testimony, and verified news reports. While we will avoid graphic language, we approach this case with the seriousness it demands. Viewer discretion is advised. If this is your first time here, let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe stories like Lily's need to be heard, please subscribe and share. Your voice helps bring these cases into the light and keeps the pressure on those who failed to act. This is the story of Lily Furneaux, and this time, the silence will not win. Lily Lynette Furneaux was born on May 14, 2008 in Michigan. From the start, she brought light into the lives of those around her. A bright, expressive little girl whose presence transformed the home she shared with her mother, Lauren. At 22, Lauren embraced motherhood with the help of her parents, creating a nurturing environment where Lily thrived. She wasn't just a baby, they saw her as the heart of the family. Lily's father, Jeffrey Wolfenbarger, had met Lauren during a summer in 2007. Their connection was brief, and by the time Lily was born, the relationship had ended. Jeffrey had already moved on and soon became involved with another woman, Renee King, who had children of her own. What followed wasn't uncommon: a custody hearing, legal filings, and a court decision. But what should have been a standard arrangement quickly became the center of growing concern. In July 2008, when Lily was only 3 months old, Judge Michael Higgins of Lapeer County Family Court awarded joint custody. Lily would spend 3 days a week with Jeffrey and 4 with Lauren. It was a decision that would later draw significant scrutiny, not only because of Lily's age, but because of the courtroom dynamic. During hearings, Judge Higgins reportedly dismissed professional recommendations from child welfare advocates who expressed reservations about separating an infant from her primary caregiver for extended periods. He rebuked Lauren's concerns as emotional overreactions, at one point suggesting she had no right to expect anything different. According to court transcripts, Higgins said, "You had a baby with this man and now you're devastated. Too bad. Get used to it." The courtroom environment became a place where Lauren's fears felt minimized, and her advocacy on behalf of her daughter was repeatedly challenged. She complied with the court's decision, but as the weeks passed, unease began to grow. Lauren started observing changes after Lily returned from visitations. She seemed withdrawn at times, less talkative, more sensitive. Lauren took notes. She documented what she could, but every concern she raised was filtered through a legal system that seemed unwilling to re-examine its stance. Her attorney advised caution. Pressing the issue too forcefully could result in retaliation from the court, even a reduction in her custody. The advice was simple: follow the order, no matter how difficult it felt. This period marked the beginning of a complex, one-sided struggle. Lauren was caught between what she saw as a threat to her daughter's well-being and the reality of a court order she could not ignore. Each week the handovers continued. Each week the concern deepened. It wasn't that no one knew what was happening. Lauren spoke up. She followed every recommended path. But the weight of procedure overshadowed intuition, and as months passed, a clear picture began to form of a mother trying to protect her child within a system not designed to listen. Renee King came into Lily's life as a stepmother, a role she took on after marrying Jeffrey Wolfenbarger, who already had 3 children from a previous relationship. The family dynamic wasn't perfect, but it wasn't unusual. Like many blended families, they were navigating the complexities of adjusting to one another. But Renee's own struggles with chronic pain began to interfere with her ability to care for the children. She had been prescribed medication to manage her condition, and as time went on, the physical toll it took on her became more evident. While Jeffrey worked, Renee was often left to care for Lily. At first, this seemed normal, a stepmother looking after a young child, taking on responsibilities that come with the role. But as months passed, something began to change. There were subtle shifts in Renee's interactions with Lily. The once lively child became more reserved during the visits. She seemed distant and uneasy, not like herself. It was unclear why, but Lauren, Lily's mother, began to feel a sense of dread. Lauren's concerns intensified when Lily returned from visits with small marks on her body. Nothing overt, but enough to make any mother uneasy. Renee offered explanations. The marks were simply the result of Lily being a typical toddler, clumsy and prone to mishaps. Yet Lauren couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Taking action, Lauren began documenting the incidents. She took pictures and wrote down what had been happening. Her fears were growing, and she reached out to a lawyer for advice, but each time she was met with caution. Her lawyer warned her that pushing too hard could risk her custody arrangement. The legal system seemed more focused on maintaining the status quo than addressing her concerns. Renee's personal struggles were also becoming more apparent. As she dealt with the physical toll of her health issues, she grew more irritable and withdrawn. It was clear that caring for multiple children, including Lily, was overwhelming her. Despite these signs, no action was taken by authorities. Lily continued to be sent to Renee's home, and the cycle continued. Behind the scenes, Lauren was left feeling isolated in her pursuit of what she believed was best for her daughter. The system that was supposed to protect children wasn't responding to her warnings, leaving her with the constant anxiety that her daughter's well-being was at risk. As time went on, the cracks in the system became more obvious. The warning signs were clear: a stepmother struggling with personal challenges, a child showing signs of discomfort, and a legal system that didn't act. But with each passing day, the system failed to intervene. And Lily, despite her mother's best efforts, was caught in the middle. On the morning of November 20th, 2010, everything seemed like any other day. The routine was familiar, too familiar. Lauren, as she had done countless times before, drove Lily to the designated meeting spot. It was part of the custody arrangement, an arrangement that had become both a necessary procedure and an emotional burden. Every week, Lauren went through the motions, the goodbyes, the promises, the hope that one day things would change. She kissed Lily goodbye, her voice filled with the same reassurance she had always given her. "I'll see you soon, baby. I love you." But this time something felt different. Lauren couldn't put her finger on it, but she felt it in the pit of her stomach. The familiar routine, the ritual of dropping her daughter off at the same spot, felt heavier than usual. The anxiety she had been trying to ignore for months pressed against her chest like a vice. Yet as she watched Lily walk away, unaware of the weight in her mother's heart, Lauren had no reason to believe that this time would be different. It was supposed to be like every other time, but as she turned her car around and headed home, an unsettling feeling lingered. For Lauren, it had become a constant struggle, the system that had failed her, the legal battles that seemed endless, and the growing fear that her daughter's safety was at risk. Every week, as Lily was handed over to her father and stepmother, Lauren's fear grew, though she had no concrete reason to act on it. What followed that day, however, would prove that the fear was not unfounded. By the time the afternoon arrived, the events that were unfolding were anything but ordinary. Routine had in fact shifted into something ominous, but Lauren couldn't have known how dire the situation would become. After dropping Lily off, Lauren returned home, but the pit in her stomach never loosened. She tried to distract herself with the usual tasks, but there was no shaking the feeling that something was wrong. Little did she know, in the trailer just miles away, the atmosphere was about to change for good. Renee King, Lily's stepmother, was at home, as she often was when Jeffrey was working. As the day wore on, she seemed to be in her typical routine, looking after Lily as she did each week. However, there was something brewing in the background, something unspoken, and when the afternoon turned to evening, the phone call that came next would irrevocably change everything. Around 1:30 p.m., Renee called 911. The report she gave was alarming, yet it seemed almost too mundane to trigger the immediate concern that would later arise. She claimed that Lily had slipped in the shower, an explanation that would eventually be questioned by investigators. It seemed to be a simple accident, the kind of incident that could happen to any child, yet it raised enough concern to prompt an immediate response from emergency services. The emergency responders arrived at the trailer in New Haven, Michigan, where they found Lily unresponsive on the floor of the living room. The scene they encountered did not match the simple, everyday accident described by Renee. The living room was quiet, with a kind of stillness that comes only after something catastrophic has happened. Lily's body lay there, and the responders noted the immediate absence of visible signs of life. Renee's account of what had happened continued to evolve. Initially, she maintained that Lily had fallen in the shower, but when questioned further, her responses began to shift. There were inconsistencies in her statements, and the paramedics quickly began to notice that the narrative wasn't aligning with what they saw. The contradictions raised the first serious doubts about the situation, and they quickly realized this might not be the straightforward accident they had assumed it was. As the paramedics worked to assess Lily's condition, their attempts to revive her were unsuccessful. The vital signs they monitored weren't encouraging. They rushed her to the hospital, hoping for some chance of recovery, but there was little hope left by the time they arrived at the medical facility. Despite their best efforts, Lily was pronounced dead at 3:27 p.m. The hospital staff, while accustomed to dealing with emergency situations, could immediately tell that the circumstances surrounding Lily's death were highly suspicious. Her injuries did not align with a fall in the shower. While doctors worked to try and resuscitate Lily, they observed signs that would later be confirmed in the autopsy report: multiple blunt force injuries that were inconsistent with the story told by Renee. The timeline of the events was also problematic. Renee's version of the story didn't add up with what they were seeing in front of them. But it wasn't just the medical staff that was noticing the inconsistencies. Investigators began to suspect foul play, and the questioning of Renee began almost immediately after Lily was declared dead. Renee continued to insist that the incident had been an unfortunate accident, but her narrative changed as she was questioned. Her claim started to falter, and the authorities could see that there were things she was leaving out. Things that didn't quite make sense. The contradictions in Renee's statements and the clinical findings about Lily's injuries soon led to a shift in the investigation. The inconsistencies in Renee's story, combined with the failure to revive Lily, pointed to something more serious, and the truth would come to light in the following days. But what followed next was not just a simple uncovering of events. It was the beginning of an investigation that would reveal far more about the people entrusted with Lily's care, and the missed opportunities by those who were supposed to protect her. What had started as a routine handover under the supervision of the courts had now spiraled into a tragedy, one that exposed not only the dangers present in Lily's home, but also the flaws in a system that had failed her time and again. As the investigation deepened, the community began to react. The legal system, which had failed to act on numerous red flags in Lily's case, would soon come under scrutiny. But even then, the question remained, how could it have gone this far without anyone stepping in? The unanswered questions would lead to the slow unraveling of what was happening inside Lily's home. It would take time for the full picture to come into focus, but the investigation was only beginning, and the tragic death of a child would soon uncover a larger system of neglect. As the investigation into Lily's death unfolded, the medical examiner's report provided critical insight into the events leading up to her untimely passing. On November 20, 2010, Lily was declared deceased at the hospital, but what came next would raise serious questions about the circumstances surrounding her death. The medical examiner's findings would soon confirm what many had feared. The cause of death was homicide, a result that shocked many in the community who had initially assumed it was a tragic accident. Lily's injuries, as outlined in the report, were extensive. Multiple contusions, particularly to the head, indicated that something far more violent than a simple fall had occurred. As investigators combed through the findings, it became increasingly clear that the injuries Lily sustained were inconsistent with the story Renee had told. According to the medical examiner, the nature of the injuries, especially the pattern of trauma to the head, suggested deliberate force. This wasn't an accidental fall. It was something much more serious, and the evidence made that clear. Renee, in her initial statement to the authorities, claimed that she had accidentally fallen with Lily in her arms. She explained that while trying to carry her, she lost her footing, which resulted in Lily's fall. But the evidence did not support this claim. After further questioning, Renee acknowledged that there had been rougher interactions between her and Lily in the past, particularly when she was feeling overwhelmed and stressed. She admitted that under pressure she had handled Lily in ways that were less than gentle, though she denied any intentional harm. The forensic analysis painted a picture that was far darker than Renee's explanation. The pattern of trauma found on Lily's body didn't match a simple fall in the shower. Instead, the injuries appeared to be consistent with deliberate force being applied to the child. The placement and severity of the bruises indicated that Lily had likely been struck multiple times. This was not the accident Renee had described, but something far more troubling. As the investigators began to examine the scene of the incident, more red flags appeared. Signs suggested that the area had been cleaned before emergency responders arrived, something that immediately raised suspicions. The lack of blood or other physical evidence around the area where Lily was found was unusual, and the quick actions taken to clean the scene indicated an attempt to conceal the truth. The cleaning of the scene was a clear sign that someone had tried to hide evidence, making it even harder to determine the exact timeline of events. The discrepancies in Renee's story also became evident during the timeline analysis. The injuries sustained by Lily didn't align with the narrative provided by Renee. According to medical staff and law enforcement, the injuries would have required a much longer period of time to inflict than what Renee had described. She had claimed that Lily's fall happened in the morning, but the severity of the injuries suggested that they had occurred earlier in the day. not just moments before the 911 call. This inconsistency between the physical evidence and Renee's statements forced investigators to dig deeper into what had truly happened that afternoon. As investigators continued to piece together the evidence, it became increasingly apparent that this wasn't just an accidental fall. The medical findings, the inconsistencies in Renee's statements, and the physical evidence all pointed to one conclusion. Lily had been deliberately harmed. The case, once considered a possible accident, was now a clear case of violence. The forensic investigation not only confirmed the cause of death, but also opened a deeper conversation about the patterns of abuse that can go unnoticed. The fact that someone in a trusted position had inflicted such harm on a child was a heartbreaking reality. And as the investigation moved forward, more questions arose about how a system meant to protect children had failed Lily, even when there were clear signs of distress and harm. What followed was a slow but steady process of uncovering the truth, piece by piece. The forensic findings were only the beginning of the investigation, but they set the stage for what would eventually become a tragic but clear case of deliberate harm, one that had been hidden behind a facade of normalcy. And as the truth emerged, the community, still reeling from the loss of a young child, began to demand justice. In February 2012, the case of Lily Furneaux reached its most crucial point. The courtroom. Renee King stood trial for the events that unfolded on that fateful day in November 2010. The charges against her were serious: murder, child neglect, and criminal conduct related to her treatment of Lily. The trial began with testimonies from paramedics, medical professionals, and Lauren's family. The paramedics who had arrived on the scene that day shared their observations of the inconsistencies in Renee's statements. Initially, Renee had described the incident as an accident, but the evidence from the medical staff suggested otherwise. The medical professionals explained how Lily's injuries were not typical of an accidental fall, describing instead a pattern of physical harm that did not align with the story Renee had provided. Lauren Furneaux, Lily's mother, gave an emotional yet composed testimony. She spoke about her daughter's life, about the bright and energetic child she had known, and about the growing concerns she had with each visit to Jeffrey's home. Lauren explained how, over time, she noticed changes in Lily's behavior. She became withdrawn, anxious, and sometimes fearful after being in her father's and Renee's care. Lauren described the signs she had observed and the unanswered questions that kept her awake at night. She spoke of the emotional toll that came with trying to protect her child in a system that did not seem to hear her. Renee, on the other hand, offered a defense that appeared weak in comparison to the mounting evidence. Her initial explanation that Lily had simply fallen began to unravel as more details came to light. Her statements about the events that led to Lily's hospitalization were inconsistent, and the more she was questioned, the more her story shifted. Renee admitted to handling Lily roughly on occasion, especially when overwhelmed, but denied that any harm had been intentional. Yet the forensic evidence presented by the medical examiner contradicted this. The injuries Lily sustained were far more severe than a fall in the shower could explain. The medical findings pointed to force being applied to Lily, indicating an intentional effort to harm her. After 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all charges. The weight of the evidence, the testimonies, and the contradictions in Renee's story made the case clear. She was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom, which had been tense throughout the trial, now bore a somber air of closure for the family. However, even after the conviction, Renee's legal team filed for an appeal, hoping to overturn the decision. This effort, however, was swiftly denied, and the original sentence stood. For the family, this brought some semblance of justice, though the pain of losing Lily could never be undone. Jeffrey Wolfenbarger, who had initially stood by Renee and defended her during the early stages of the investigation, eventually distanced himself. He filed for divorce after the trial, a sign of the fractured family left in the wake of Lily's tragic end. It was clear that Jeffrey's role in the case had been complicated, but as the trial concluded, his decision to separate himself from Renee spoke volumes. During the trial, another emotional moment occurred. Lauren's brother confronted Jeffrey in the courtroom. Tensions had been building throughout the proceedings, and this altercation escalated when Jeffrey pushed past an elderly woman, leading to charges of disorderly conduct. The outburst added fuel to the fire of public outrage, highlighting just how deeply the family was affected by the events surrounding Lily's death. The trial and conviction were significant, but the impact of Lily's case would go beyond the courtroom. The case sparked widespread discussions about child protection, family court decisions, and the need for systemic change in how authorities respond to warning signs of harm. The Justice for Lily movement gained momentum, advocating for better safeguards for children in custody cases. It became clear that Lily's death was not just a personal tragedy, it was a call to action for those in charge of protecting vulnerable children. The legal proceedings surrounding Lily Furneaux didn't conclude with a conviction. In the months that followed, attention turned not only to those directly involved in Lily's care, but also to the decisions made inside the courtroom. Decisions that many believed had played a role in what happened. Judge Michael Higgins, a family court judge in Lapeer County, became the focus of intense public criticism. His role in approving and maintaining the custody arrangement that placed Lily in a shared environment was now being reviewed under a different light. Throughout the case, he had been repeatedly accused of disregarding the concerns raised by Lily's mother, Lauren Furneaux. Lauren had brought forward reports of behavioral shifts in Lily and had expressed increasing unease about the circumstances during visits with her father and stepmother. Yet Judge Higgins was seen as resistant to those warnings. He had dismissed formal assessments from professionals in child welfare who questioned whether Lily was emotionally prepared to be in a rotating custody arrangement at such a young age. According to legal observers, he maintained a rigid stance favoring shared custody, even in situations where one parent voiced compelling concerns. What alarmed many was not just his decision-making, but his courtroom demeanor. Higgins was said to have taken a particularly skeptical approach towards single mothers, including Lauren. Her requests for full custody, even when supported by evaluations, were denied. And when she returned to court after raising further concerns, those pleas were minimized. In hindsight, his approach was seen not just as dismissive, but as emblematic of a system that too often overlooks warning signs. Following Lily's passing, Lauren pursued a formal complaint through the Michigan Judicial Tenure Commission. The complaint cited Higgins' repeated refusal to act on expert testimony, his lack of responsiveness to Lauren's documented concerns, and his overall conduct during the hearings. But despite the weight of the situation and public outcry, no disciplinary action was taken. The commission reviewed the complaint, then closed it without issuing consequences. To Lauren and many others, this inaction sent a clear message. Even when serious concerns are raised, the gatekeepers of accountability may still look the other way. Parallel to the judicial complaint, Lauren filed a civil lawsuit against Renee King and Jeffrey Wolfenbarger, alleging negligence in their care of Lily. The suit sought damages exceeding $25,000, and it marked another attempt to hold individuals accountable, this time outside of the criminal court system. The lawsuit drew attention from legal observers across the state, many of whom viewed it as a critical test of how family courts and caregivers could be held liable when credible concerns are overlooked. The outcome of the suit, however, was never made public. Whether it was resolved in court, settled privately, or dismissed is unknown. The lack of closure in the civil arena left many frustrated, but it did little to quiet the growing conversation around accountability in child protection cases. What became increasingly clear was that this case was no longer just about one child or one decision. It was about the cumulative effect of choices made by people in positions of authority. Choices that, when left unchallenged, can lead to irreversible consequences. As more details became public, community members, advocacy groups, and legal professionals began asking deeper questions. How often are expert recommendations ignored? How many parents are left to battle courts alone when their concerns aren't taken seriously? And most importantly, what changes are needed to ensure that the same mistakes are never repeated? We aim to point out a broader crisis, one where warnings went unheard, procedures took precedence over protection, and decisions made in courtrooms had long-lasting effects. The public began to demand answers not only about what happened in the past, but about what could be done to protect others in the future. The failure to act decisively when concerns were raised became a turning point for many who believed the family court system needed reform. Lily's case served as a rallying point for those calling for change. It ignited conversations about the role of judges, the weight of parental testimony, and the importance of responding to early signs of vulnerability. And though no amount of legal action could undo the past, the hope was that her story would serve as a reminder to listen sooner, to intervene faster, and to never assume that silence means safety. In the months following the trial, the effects of the Lily Furneaux case extended well beyond the courtroom. As the legal proceedings came to a close, a movement began to take shape, driven not only by grief but by an urgent need for change. The Justice for Lily campaign emerged as a response to a community's call for accountability. What began as a small initiative by Lily's family grew quickly. Supported by advocates, legal experts, and everyday citizens, it became a powerful voice echoing through Michigan and beyond. At its core was a clear message: no child should fall through the gaps of the very system meant to protect them. Candlelight vigils were held in Lily's memory. Community members gathered outside courthouses, not with anger but with quiet determination. Signs, photographs, and letters were displayed as a show of solidarity. Letters were sent to local officials. Public discussions were hosted by legal groups and child advocacy organizations. This was not just about honoring Lily's life. It was about demanding that her experience not be repeated. Although the campaign did not result in immediate legislative reform, its impact was unmistakable. It sparked renewed conversations across the state, among judges, attorneys, policymakers, and families. Debates began to focus on how custody decisions are made and whether enough weight is given to concerns raised by primary caregivers. Child welfare professionals began to speak more candidly. Issues once discussed only behind closed doors, bias in family court, uneven application of expert input, lack of trauma-informed procedures, were now being addressed in public forums. Across advocacy networks, Lily's case was often cited as a pivotal example of how breakdowns in communication and institutional reluctance can produce consequences far beyond the courtroom. More importantly, the campaign gave others the confidence to step forward. Parents who had long stayed silent about questionable custody rulings or who had hesitated to challenge a court's decision out of fear began to speak. Some joined advocacy groups. Others began legal proceedings of their own. Lily's story gave them language for their own experiences and a sense of urgency to act. What had once been a case defined by loss was now becoming a blueprint for reform. Workshops were hosted across Michigan on judicial discretion and parental advocacy. Conversations shifted from what happened to how do we make sure this never happens again. But perhaps most crucially, the campaign highlighted the power of collective awareness. It reminded institutions that public trust must be earned, and that when courts appear to ignore warnings, communities take notice. The push for systemic reflection was growing, and it wasn't being led by lawmakers alone. It was being carried by people who had seen firsthand what silence can cost. What happened to Lily Furneaux revealed more than the failure of a few individuals. It exposed a deeper flaw in how risk is measured, how concerns are handled, and how trust can be misplaced when the wrong voices are amplified and the right ones are dismissed. Her story showed what happens when the systems we rely on prioritize routine over responsibility, when efficiency overshadows empathy, and when institutions wait for proof instead of acting on credible concern. The lessons from this case are unmistakable. When a parent speaks, they must be heard, not minimized. When warning signs appear, they must be taken seriously, not explained away. And when decisions are made about a child's care, every voice, especially those closest to the child, must be considered. This wasn't just about what went wrong, it was about what could still be done. Lily's case served as a catalyst for change. It prompted a necessary reckoning with the systems in place and the blind spots within them. And in doing so, it reminded everyone watching that vigilance begins not in policy, but in presence. If you've watched this far, thank you. You've honored a child whose voice was quieted too soon, and by doing so, you've added your voice to the conversation that still needs to happen. Share this documentary. Start the conversation. Raise the question in your own community, because silence protects nothing, and awareness changes everything.